Professor Roy Webb has been Vice Chancellor of Griffith University since 1985 and is currently the longest serving Vice Chancellor among all Australian universities. During Professor Webb's tenure, Griffith has experienced considerable growth, including the addition of new campuses. Such growth is almost unrivalled among universities in Australia. At the end of 1999, the university employed 2,600 staff, of whom 1,000 were academic staff, and nearly 23,000 students were enrolled. Griffith has annual revenues in excess of $250 million. Professor Webb's leadership qualities have been critical to the growth and development of Griffith University. He has steered Griffith to a unique position among Australian universities with a mix of products and services over 6 campuses. It's on the topic of leadership that I'll be talking to Professor Webb today. Prior to his appointment at Griffith, Professor Webb had a distinguished career as an economist, serving on many bodies during his time at Melbourne and La Trobe universities, as well as at Cornell University in the USA. In recognition of his distinguished career, his honours include the title of Professor Emeritus from Melbourne University and the election as a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences. Professor Webb, thank you very much for giving of your valuable time from a very busy schedule today. The first question I'd like to ask is, how do you distinguish between leadership and management?
Yes, I often get asked that question. It may disappoint you to hear that I'm not too sure that the differences are as important as the similarities. There is a difference, of course. You can manage a static organisation. You can manage an organisation that's going nowhere. You can manage it well, I suppose, but I'm inclined to emphasise the overlap myself. I mean, you can't do a good job of leadership, in my view, without including a lot of management of change, management of finding directions and of implementing achieving a commitment to directions. And similarly, management without some direction, management without some sense of vision and target is a pretty flat affair. So there are differences, but I think the overlap is quite significant.
What is the essence of leadership to you?
The essence of leadership, well, I think the essence of leadership has to be finding directions and identifying them and then achieving commitment to them. The processes involved in that are sometimes complex and sometimes may not involve people having a sense of being led, particularly in academia.
It has been said that academics are reluctant leaders. Do you think that this is generally true?
Yes, I think it grows out of a culture. The reluctance about assuming a leadership role are often stated. I'm not quite sure how deeply felt. But the reluctance about assuming it stems from, I think, the fact that a lot of academic leaders of academic institutions, do come from academia. And so I think the reluctance is embedded earlier on in the process, a reluctance about being led. Academics are essentially professional individuals who work in a collegiate and corporate environment, the corporate environment of the university, but they see themselves very much as individual scholars pursuing their particular directions, whether it's teaching and learning or research, or both. And I think there is a deeply embedded resistance in academia still to the idea of being led, since that's the font or the pool from which academic leaders still largely are drawn in terms of administrative positions. That I think flows into the style and thought patterns of leaders in academia. But it is changing. I think it is changing. I think the culture of of universities is changing as they realise that, as the people in them realise that directions are important, and that we're no longer able to rely on government subsidy, no questions asked about how it's spent, and issues of accountability. As those matters are more pervasive in our organisations, I think we will see a greater interest in leadership, a greater willingness to follow and respond to leadership, and flowing out of that, a greater interest in, or greater willingness to commit to leadership in the language of leadership by our leaders.
So something in the external environment, particularly the economic environment, is driving a sort of new change in the...
I don't think there's the slightest doubt about that. I think universities would not have changed to the extent that they have changed without external involvement and external pressures, some technological, but I think mainly in the university's case arising out of government policy.
And Vice Chancellor, how would you describe your own leadership style?
I've been asked this question before, Ian, and my phrase is that I try to mix two ingredients. One is under the phrase moving and shaking, and you have to do a bit of that occasionally. You have to be seen to be questioning and resisting no change, and encouraging certain kinds of change, and shaking the system a bit to achieve that. On the other hand, I also think it's very important to use, in my case, another phrase which I use, happens to rhyme with it, which helps remember it, smoothing and shaping. So there's quite a lot of work in achieving the implementation of directions and getting commitment to directions and change of a smoothing and shaping kind. That is to say, making sure that rough edges are attended to, making sure that people's feelings are attended to, trying to ensure and that the shaping of the organisation in terms of its constituent parts, its systems, the people who might not feel closely associated with a particular directional change, they need to be involved in it, and that I put under a broad heading of smoothing and shaping, which has to accompany such moving and shaking as one is able to do.
So this suggests that you change your leadership style depending on the situation.
Well, you could express it that way, or one might express it as blending the two, rather than switching on and off as between two styles. I hope more of a blending of the two.
Vice Chancellor, during your time at Griffith University, you've been involved in a very large number of senior selection panels for professors and other very senior posts. How important are leadership qualities when you interview people on these selection panels?
Well, as you would know better than most, given your background, the value of an interview, the value of the interview as an indicator of anything is still, shall we say, the subject of research, and juries are out on that question. Nevertheless, we do attach a lot of importance to interviews in our own recruitment of staff, senior staff particularly, associate professors, directors of offices. And it is a good question as to how one, in chairing those processes, as I've done on many occasions, how one tries to identify the people who do have capacity. Obviously, to some extent, it's on the basis of their record to date. Have they been innovative? Have they achieved the implementation of change where they've been? And that might be, as it were, at quite modest levels in terms of teaching and learning arrangements and practices, or it might be research work in terms of developing teams. But certainly in our leadership, in our promotion protocols for promotion to professor, we now have a very strong emphasis on leadership as a required quality, and some very able scholars don't have it, and some do, and we're trying to find those who do. But I guess it's more in terms of what they've achieved to date than by necessarily simply believing statements made in an interview about themselves. That we would try to focus on that quality.
So looking at a combination of track record and opportunities to date, probably?
Yes, I think so. Yes, I don't think leadership quality necessarily shines through a face at an interview, or shines or is revealed through the words used in an interview, although of course we try to achieve a dialogue that would demonstrate and draw out those qualities. I think the track record to date is a more convincing matter.
What do you think are the main things that a Vice Chancellor can influence as a leader?
Well, a great deal. Sometimes not always through loud and noisy decisions, but you can make quite significant changes to directions by saying yes to some things and no to others. I've often remarked these are the only essays you need to be able to write as a Vice Chancellor. Simple words like that. Here at Logan, for example, the focus on flexible learning was a simple decision of mine, that we would instead of spattering and scattering our resources across the whole academic spectrum, all campuses, any old subject, any old course, which we were doing for a while, I decided that we would achieve more progress towards being a leading flexible learning institution through focusing the work here at Logan and the resources and the development of the skills, and that's what we've done. But essentially, in terms of how to do it, it was an administrative decision to control resource allocation. It can be done on occasions. It can't be done on all occasions, but sometimes that instrument of resource allocation is the most powerful way to achieve change.
Can you give one or two more examples?
Well, because this is not a new trick. Our federal and other funding masters have been down this pathway before us. So often ministers of government who want to achieve change will make funding conditional on the implementation of certain priorities, certain targets, certain change objectives. Within Griffith, well, of course, through my colleagues who from time to time have served as Deputy Vice Chancellor's Research, we have quite a number of programs designed to focus and target research objectives and particular research activities. Very much, of course, in the context of federal government policies that require concentration and focus. This process has been going on now for approximately 20 years, but the latest white paper is a further step in the direction of implementation of a philosophy that suggests concentration and selectivity is an important ingredient of research achievement. Still debated in universities, but we have to recognise that it is the trend in our funding environment, and in some areas it's demonstrably true, though not true in all areas.
You mentioned vision in leadership earlier. How important is vision in leadership? Well,
I think it's a question of what do we mean by it. You'll be familiar with my colleague Ralph Mortley's proposition that if he has visions, he thinks of seeing his doctor rather than rushing out and implementing directions for change in a university. But I guess that's the lighter side of it. I think direction is perhaps a more operational word in the context of universities. University work finding a pathway and a direction into the future is a more important concept to me than considering a destination to which the concept of vision, one might envision a destination, okay, but I think given the dynamism of our environment and the changes in the political and economic and policy environment, having a handle on the direction is important. I suppose the analogy of navigating a ship. It's important, of course, to know where you're going, but it's important to be able to keep that direction, whatever the buffeting, whatever the pressures that might temporarily push you off target, off track.
So, how do you communicate this sense of direction to other people?
Well, here I suppose there is evidence of a variety of styles. I'm not, I think, a flag-waving type of leader. I don't do much that I could construe as over the calling the troops to follow me over the trench tops. I don't think there's much that universities do that's open to that kind of, shall I say, heroic leadership. But there's plenty you can do, as I said much earlier in our discussion. There's plenty you can do that's not always identified as a leadership move, and some of these things are quiet and indeed maybe at the time unnoticed, but they can have big impacts. I suppose the analogy from chaos theory appeals to me. You place a twig in a stream upstream, and it can have enormous effects downstream in terms of currents and dynamic effects in the river system. Wasn't the analogy a butterfly can flap its wings and then a cyclone can develop in another country? So some of the changes that can be quite momentous might have quite small origins in terms of how they're implemented.
So almost like planting a seed and
I think so. I think so. Yes. Yeah. I like to think our commitment to flexible learning is of this nature. It's growing now in the university as people begin to put their own meanings on it and in their own academic areas give shape to the idea. But essentially, the idea was planted upstream. But now, of course, it's acquiring a lot of momentum and commitment around the traps.
And allows us to do things like we're doing today.
Yes.
So, Vice Chancellor, what are your final thoughts on the topic of leadership?
Well, my final thoughts. Of course, I'll be soon handing over to someone else whose thoughts in relation to Griffith are going to be more relevant than mine. My final thoughts is my final thought. I wouldn't actually like to carry it as final, but I think leadership involves a certain degree of humility. Universities are very good at reminding you of that if you forget it. Being aware of the limitations of power as much as the opportunities that are there. If you mistake the limits of your capacity to change, then you can fail to achieve any change. There are a number of careers around that demonstrate that particular oversight. But I think it is important to know your industry. A lot of university academics still rather resent the word industry, but leave aside that debate. You have to be thinking about. You're thinking about the activity you're in, and that your colleagues are in. Their jobs are depending on it. Often their focus is more local. A leadership team, and of course I haven't stressed, but I should, that everything I'm saying is in the context of a university having a leadership team. It's important for the leadership team to be active in thinking about futures of their industry and of their institution in the interest of its future vitality.
Vice Chancellor, thank you very much indeed for your time with us today.
Thank you, Ian.